Well, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Certified Forgotten. We are still and always your horror podcast that talks about films with 10 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. Most of the time, I'm going to be perfectly honest, most of the time that means we talk about smaller, independent, niche films from no-name filmmakers that have passed through film festivals in the last 5 or 10 years. But every now and then we get to talk about a certified horror auteur, a fucking banger, somebody that is in like the Hall of Fame of horror filmmakers. And that's going to happen on this week's episode, which I'm very, very excited about. Donato, are you as pumped as I am to talk about a Kurosawa film today?
Yeah, I mean, like this highlights what we talk about. Okay, bye, Rogers. This highlights what we talk about in Certified Forgotten all the time. How does a movie actually not have this amount of reviews? Like, and how does a Kurosawa film get to our podcast? It's always the curious question of why was it ignored, how is it ignored, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because again, like when we talk about something like maybe in the future we'll talk about The Battery. I think it's always a great example of a beloved indie that we all know in the horror sphere, but we understand why it didn't break out, let's say, into the mainstream. But like, I don't know, a Lionsgate release, a Kurosawa release, like how did this one fall through the cracks? So I'm excited to talk about that today, not only with you, Mr. Monagle, but as always,
But
with
who?
if you didn't read the title of the episode, that spoiled it already. We have today a voice that I have been listening to for quite a while on horror podcast, but now also a filmmaker and has been a filmmaker forever. So today, podcaster, filmmaker, Elric Kane, thank you for coming.
Thanks, guys. This is exciting.
So Elric, first question for you is, and I'm gonna make you pick a baby here. I love the fact that you do a little bit of everything. I love the fact that you're an academic. I love the fact that you're a podcaster, a filmmaker. You're basically, the dream of anybody that loves film and just wants to be involved in as many parts of the industry as possible. So, picking your baby, is there a hat that you wear that maybe you like a little bit more, or you take to a little bit more than some of the others?
Yeah, I mean, except for getting paid. Everyone
Sure.
could be envious outside of that. Yeah, definitely filmmaking, because that's the thing that got. I mean, movie obsessive can take you in lots of directions, and so I was movie obsessed kid. But the filmmaking, and not known in this country as a filmmaker, but like starting to make things was what got me excited and kept leading me deeper into film love. And it was always with the desire to make stuff, even in the periods where I wasn't doing stuff. So I would say that is definitely the driving force that led me to going to film school, which led me to going, oh, I could, to make a living, I could be teaching part time, which
Mhm.
then takes over your life, because making a living becomes the, as we all know, it's you have to find something to do that. And so I think the things spoke to themselves. I think then I fell into the podcast, like literally fell into, didn't even know what a podcast really was, and was kind of handpicked as one person to join a podcast. And then when it started doing well, you just kind of dive deeper into it. And I got to a point where I was like, I don't want to just talk about horror. I have all this interest in art house and foreign films and stuff
Mhm.
like that. So then I started Pure Cinema with Brian Sauer, just as a result of like needing to talk about that other side. And I wouldn't be surprised if doing those podcasts at that level, where you're really in, maybe satiated something for a few years, like maybe helped me not keep making movies in a way where, or at least chasing the hard part, which is the really
Yeah.
hard part, which is just figuring out how the hell to get money and how to mount something. I think it is. I think those streams all kind of connect. But in my case, I think I've always just been a filmmaker, and that's, I think, the thing I'm least known for in this country, because I wasn't doing it when I got here. I moved here to make films and then got sidetracked with every other thing. So part of doing a film right now was like a kind of just personal. It was almost like not for anyone else. It was for me to kind of reclaim what I feel I wanted to do, and just it's like a conversation with myself that now is very public, which
Yeah.
is always a little weird.
How is it coming out? Obviously you've been making films for a very long time, but rediscovering that part of yourself, proving to yourself that you are a filmmaker. How has that experience been now that you have basically spent years and years and years kind of getting to know a lot of people within the film industry, having guests on your podcast to talk about movies and sort of going back into the waters? Is it more intimidating for having those connections? Is it less intimidating for knowing a lot of people and being able to text someone and say, "Hey, I'm having a problem with the scene. Can I ask you some questions?"
Yeah, I didn't pull too many favors in the funding part. Like I just kind of went to family and friends, and we built this in an unusual way. We did I like a good recommend for anyone trying to do this, which is sitting around. I need 150K to make a movie. 10 years later, no one had 150K. Oh, I'm going to ask every single person for $5,000. And that's what we did. We kind of put this, not a cap so much, but that's what we asked for. A
Yeah.
couple people came in with more. So that was like the ground game of family, friends, people we knew who could maybe afford it. So that wasn't like reaching out to those types. It's been real interesting because once you make something, I've said this, but do you know the film Cockfighter before, by chance? I've mentioned this before. Okay, so Warren Oates in that movie, he's like a braggart and he's like full of himself, and he wins the cockfighting championship one year, and then the next year he's been bragging and he loses really hard, and he takes a vow of silence. And on the whole movie that you meet this character, he doesn't talk. He's a silent character. He's the lead character, and he's not going to talk again until he wins. And I remember watching that, and I told Kayla Janice this because she wrote a book on it recently, and I was like, it was a few years ago, and I watched it again and was just like, oh yeah, that's how it feels to be a podcaster talking about film all the time, but not making your movie. Because every time I have to tell someone, oh, I'm also a filmmaker, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And you're like, just feel a little shitty about yourself, just enough. There, no one's making you feel bad, but just inside you. And so at a certain point, I kind of took that mental vow where I stopped telling people that. And I said, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to film festivals to enjoy myself. I'm not going as a podcaster. I'm cutting out all the fun stuff. And I am going to just focus on getting something made, and so I can feel like, you know, I deserved it in that sense. So that was part of it. So it's been interesting to then see some people who didn't know this, who will, you know, who find out you're making this. Most have been incredibly nice, you know, whether it's Mick Garris, who said like right straight away, oh, I just saw their screening, I'm going to get a link and watch it. Or we showed it at Brooklyn Horror, and Bill Lustig is at the back of the theater, and I'm about to, everyone has left the theater, and I'm walking out, and he's just like, well, I do have one note. I think you could have just cut that part where you explained the exposition. And I was like, oh, you mean the story? You know, the one scene that explains the plot. And he's like, yeah, just get rid of it and you're fine. And I said, it's also a finished movie, but that's okay.
Yeah.
But I'm like, it's Bill Lustig, so it's awesome.
Great
you know,
note, Bill. Great note.
yeah, this is great. I mean, okay, if it had gotten me early, I'm kind of, I think with this as a little, maybe I'd open up next time. I think I was pretty, not closed, but kind of secretive about this. It took a long time. It took a couple years in post because we didn't have any money. Once we got to post, we spent it all on the shoot. And I think outside of the editor and me and a couple of people, I kept it very until we were really close to the end. You know, we took some notes, we recut some stuff, but really it's the kind of movie like until the score is there, until this is there, you're not really seeing the movie. You know, not all movies are like that, but the kind of movies I've always been into, whether it's David Lynch and stuff, the sound, everything needs to be in there for the thing to feel the way you're hoping it feels. And
Yeah.
so it's, I wasn't somebody who was like doing a lot of testing and trying to get all my friends. And so there's a lot of people who are kind of shockingly only saw it when I showed it on the big screen about a week ago in LA. And they're all like, you know, for good or bad, like whatever their reaction is, that is how I wanted them to experience it, you know, because it was, you know, it was important to me to show them the way I had imagined it at least. But people are incredible. I mean, as you guys know, the horror, and I always have to tell non-horror people this, like the horror people I've met, the filmmakers, the supporters are like easily the nicest people I've met in this industry, like by quite a long way. And like, they're so supportive and they're so like, you know, even if it's not their thing, I'm making something that's very specific. I already know, especially in horror. Like I was saying, I just went to IFC Center. And in the Q&A, I realized something watching the movie again. I was like, oh, I made an IFC midnight movie. Not really a horror. Like it's horror, but
Yeah.
it would have been perfect. That doesn't exist anymore. So it's Shudder. And I'm stoked that they, you know, saw something in it and wanted to play it. But I also know there'll be a lot of people who this won't hit their hard horror button, you know, and some might surprise, which is always fun. It's fun when it's the person who I've seen a couple of people like, this isn't usually my thing, but I got into this and it's, you know, that's exciting. So, you know, you know what you're making. You have no idea how it's going to come off though. Right.
Yeah, and I did want to say, you know, like it feels like the double-edged sword where you're talking about podcasting, but also filmmaking. And I mean, you know, this is coming from, again, someone who has heard your voice many times prior to even, again, knowing you were a filmmaker. But I think, you know, the way that you guys and Shockwaves, I'll reference once and just say like Shockwaves, I think influenced a ton of horror podcasters and what would come after that. And it's like, that is how people began to know like who you were. But it is more exciting to see the filmmaker side. It's more exciting to see you creating things. And it is, we all talk and, you know, we're critics on our side, me and Monocle. So what we do is, I call it creative, but again, we're not making the movies. My favorite thing when a filmmaker is like, oh, like, thank you for your positive review. I'm like, I didn't do shit. I'm like, I watched your movie and I wrote some words about it. Like, you went through the entire process of making a movie. And like, that is miraculous in its own right. So like, man, I mean, like, my question is, living in LA, how did you so perfectly distill my fear of the
No,
fear and the experience of dating in LA, but also my existential dread of not knowing what comes after life.
Okay, I'll try. I'll try for those. I also go back to your critic note though. Something I've just realized reading some of the really interesting reviews. A good review, like a really good review, tells you something you didn't quite know about your own work. And a bad review tells you exactly what you know you got wrong. And so when you're watching it, you're like, oh, yeah, well, I already know that. Like they always circle in on the thing that you already feel insecure about. But the good ones are like, somebody was writing something about like it being like the opening shot is a girl walking down a hallway with the phone. And this amazing Scottish, woman I met, she was like, it's a Gothic tradition. She's walking down with the candle in the castle. And I was like, never would have entered my mind. So anyway, so critics, that's saying I think critics should remember that, and also bad reviews can sometimes do that, but rarely do they tell you something you didn't know. LA, as we all know, like it's been really nice the last couple of weeks to see how much LA has had a nice little kind of resurge after the fires of just how people feel about the city. And I know we're all mixed. We go through our wave of emotions living in a city like this, of course. And I think I was making this from maybe a slightly bleaker spot about it, but it was so important that LA was a character in this film, and obviously we knew that would cost us more because we could have gone somewhere smaller and shot. This is the kind of story that it really needed to be a city story. It was definitely a urban story, but so I was working in the offices that the character works in, so we filmed in the offices, and a lot of the locations are places kind of not quite stolen, but pretty well worn, and I knew I knew all the kind of angles on the places, so that was important to try to get the fabric of the city. I was very interested in that LA is a very sleepy town at night, and it's rarely outside of like Michael Mann's film and a few others, it's rare that we see like total LA movies at night, and I've never really liked the way LA looks on film during the day. Weirdly, I just feel it's kind of a generic, I don't know, outside of To Live and Die in LA or something. So I was like, okay, I think I want this to be a night, and we're in this time now where you guys know as critics and people who are probably piecemealing your living together from various things. It's like temporary jobs, temporary housing, working at nights, that is, and temporary love lives became something I just was really interested in how that all can combine into how a character might feel doomed in a sense. And so the actual idea then just sparked because I had a woman I worked with, and she would always talk about these horrific dates and like funny dates, and some of them were just, she was kind of like just somebody who used all the different apps, and it just sounded like a full-time job to me. Like I was like, how are you? And she was funny, she
Yeah.
wasn't like our character, but I was like so interested in that. And I think where I differ and sometimes get into arguments with people who are all about write what you know, I agree with that, but I think it's maybe more important to write what you want to know. And I think there's your imagination and your desire to understand people and understand situations that are outside your skin is something that I understand guys so much better. I'm so uninterested in making a film about a guy. I feel like I understand myself fairly well. I'm not interested in making a character like me. I'll never fully understand women. I'll never fully understand some of the motives. So I find myself very drawn to those kind of stories, even though I was raised by just a mom and a sister. I think there's something to that, and that often gets overlooked when people give writing help. And for me, I wanted to know about this online dating world, and I wanted to know based on this one story. And then I just kind of, me and my writing partner really kind of focused in on it. And we had a lot of good side conversations with people who were in it. And and then you hope that the fabric of the thing you're doing is real. I would say once we cast Blue, we ran a lot of things by her, and so part of it was she became a bit of our filter for the story as well, to make sure, like she changed the dating app name straight away. In our script, it was You Got a Match, and she was like, you can't call a dating app that. And I was like, all right. Shame.
No, and again, like I think it is, coming from a male perspective, like obviously there is such a different aspect to dating on those apps and safety and stuff for women alone, obviously.
Things we don't even think about. And I remember being quite like during the start of Me Too, or just in the start of, I think there were like hearings about judges or something. And I remember just walking past a woman where I worked, and she was standing in front of a TV. She had tears in her eyes. And I was like, oh, I didn't know who she was. I was like, I think a judge was being confirmed. And I said, are you okay? And she was just like, you have no idea. Like she turned to me like I represented, everyone. And she was like, you have no idea some of the stuff I've had to go through. I have to put a key between my fingers when I go to my car at night. And honestly, I can honestly say that in that moment, I realized I'd never once thought about it that way. Not in a way that just going to your car after, again, we see everything in movies, but we can only experience things the way we experience them. And that's pretty limited a lot of the time. So, and the best way we can get out of that is to talk to people and and try to understand things. And I love that about putting a story together, because it it involves more than just the two people credited as writing. Obviously it goes through more filters, and for us, Blue, that's why we gave Blue an EP credit too, because it was like, she kind of had to give us everything for this to
Yeah.
work. She couldn't hold anything back.
Yeah, I just want to give you kudos for saying, even like, trying to represent LA for what it is. And as someone who's lived here for like 5+ years, I think that concept of LA is a big city, so it is always bustling, is something we see too much. And whenever I
Yeah.
see that, I am taken out of whatever media I am watching or
Mhm.
reading, like, because that isn't LA. So I like how you actually like wanted to represent LA for what it is, because yeah, like walking around Silver Lake or something at night, it's not super packed. It's
There's no one. Yeah, no one's on the street, especially walking. I mean, it's like if you come from a walking place. Like I just was, just got back from New York, and I'm just like, it is so different. Like it's just
Yeah.
wild where you take these pockets of people on the subway together, and then you go to LA, and you're like, yeah, I might be the only person walking from the Vista to Los Feliz. That's all. You're gonna run by no one, and it's also a little lonely, and also it's kind of a sleepy town. I mean, New York is the city that doesn't sleep. LA is asleep by midnight. The bars are closing. It's unusual in a lot of ways for what people probably outside of, especially in other countries, think about LA as the entertainment hub and very sexy concept. But I don't. That hasn't been my experience at all.
I came from Brooklyn. We were out Friday, Saturday until 4 o'clock every morning. Like that was just, bars were closing down the street. We're like, yeah, we could stay here until 4 and then just go home. We're fine. And like my first weekend here, my friends are kind of packing up at like 11, and I was like, is this how it always is? And they're like, what do you mean? Like everything's shutting down. So yeah, like that was. It's refreshing to see that kind of stuff in the movie. But yeah, again, getting the dating scene stuff down, man. Like I could have a podcast episode just about the fucking stories I could tell from doing that here in LA, and it is so uniquely specific to LA because it was so different from New York too. Like dating in New York was like upfront, in your face. You always knew what someone thought about you. And in LA, it is what I saw represented here so much, of just the like conversations in and out. You do your thing, and then you just kind of move on to the next one. And the idea of like the ultimate ghosting being part of the movie, like it's fucking perfect for that.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest hesitation, and the thing I'm most glad we did was it's the opposite of what Eggers has been talking about. If you all these interviews where he's like, "I will never photograph a phone or a car,"
Yeah.
and I get that. I'm not that interested in the period stuff personally. I never have really been. I like his films, but I don't see myself making a period piece. But the thing about making something so modern, that's definitely, you definitely have a moment where you're like, okay, most horror films right now are going back, usually back to the 80s for our ideas and the kind of stuff we loved growing up, and I dig all that stuff too. But I was like, oh, but what would a modern, like right this second horror film even feel like? And trying to make it around the thing that you're avoiding, basically the phone, the dating app, the things that could just be like so cheesy. And so of course that's like the pressure is like, okay, what is the stripped down version of this that is not cheesy, that is not the jump scare version? I'm not saying somebody could, Blumhouse could have the same script and make such a different movie out of this, and they could push in different directions, and it could be a lot of fun in that way, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't be the intention I was going for. And I'm glad that if that worked for you, then I'm really glad, because that's the part where you're like, I hope the dating part and the and the kind of reality of that is what holds attention.
Well, Donato and I have very different dating experiences. I met my wife, went on one OkCupid date in New York City. We've been together for more than a decade, and I hear Donato's horror stories, and I'm just like, I think I am married, and then if anything were to ever happen, I am just done. I don't have what it takes, and this movie
Sure.
reinforced that for me. I'm like, I'm good. I'm good. There needs to be like old confirmed bachelors. That's a fine tradition, and I think that would be something I would be into.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is crazy that like how people. I think there's something when we're just talking about LA being that sparse. You do then think, oh, how would people meet the old fashioned way if things are that sparse when you're outside of a friend of a friend. And it is a shame because, like, I mean, meeting people, obviously, I was like still dating, right? Early internet dating and stuff, but not dating apps so much. But like before that, I've almost got amnesia now of how it worked,
Mhm.
because I mean that was my whole life prior, and I'm like, oh yeah, how the hell did we meet anyone? Because it just seems like this device that has meant to get us all closer has really just separated everyone into their own little bubble. And that's the big thing we were looking at. And it's unfortunately, it's like I just watched Blumhouse's Afraid, the AI one, on the the plane. And you know, the ideas in it were actually better than I thought they were going to be. The execution didn't necessarily work completely at all for me, but I was surprised even that the ideas they're tackling, like, oh, these are big ideas that we're going to be dealing with them, and that's the stuff where horror films for the next probably 10 years are going to be like dealing with what we've got coming towards us now that we really don't understand, which is like, this is just like this whole technology shift just from the phone on is like nothing in the last 100 years. Like any of
Yep.
the other technical revolutions, they're not quite. They're still groups of people. Now we're all single people. We're all alone in a weird way. And yeah. Anyway, it's a little frightening. Obviously, Kurosawa's pulse is, you know,
Yeah,
sort 20 years before we hit now, so he knew what was coming.
he did. You talked a little bit about Blue Hunt. You know, being the star of the film, also being an executive producer. I'm like the one person I've ever met who goes to the wall hard for the New Mutants. It's one of my favorite superhero movies. I think she's
Oh,
fantastic
that's
in
cool.
it. So I was really, really excited to see her in this. And I want to talk a little bit more about how she got involved in the project, especially because it seems like she's been a little picky, or the opportunities haven't been there. I hope it's pickiness. I hope it's not the opportunities haven't been there. But I'm always interested when an actor is, you know, coming of age in Hollywood, how they choose their projects and how they trust filmmakers to say, all right, I'm gonna do something with you.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's the lifeblood of the movie, but and it's not like where people it's not I don't view it as, oh, your actor saves your movie. I view it as the actor is the movie. And so
Yeah,
my casting of the right person is the whole process. Like, and if for young directors, if you don't want to have to direct much, you cast right. Once you cast right, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting and they know what they're in store for. And she definitely reacted to the fact that the character didn't speak for the first 9 pages, and that was something that really was something she was interested in doing. You won't be surprised to hear that maybe had not a great experience on New Mutants because of its kind of troubled production history. So it
yeah,
was a difficult shoot, difficult production, and then its post was obviously a mess. So there's another scenario where she's a pretty big star after that,
yeah, hell yeah,
especially given that she's opposite Anna Taylor-Joy, a guy from Stranger Things, another person from Game of Thrones. It was like such a stacked young cast, and her being at the center of it. And I thought she was like decent in it too. Like when I saw it, and enough to have stuck in my head when I started looking for people. And we went through a casting director. And I had stumbled upon her because I was definitely thinking of like, what's some other people who are just not traditional blonde hair, blue eye actors? Like, so we started going. I was like, what if the girl who walks home alone at night would, you know, that actress, who's that? Like, let's look her up. Like, let's reanimate the whole story by casting someone that we didn't have in our brain when we wrote it, you know. So we kind of started going that track, and then at some point I was like, oh yeah, I wonder what the person from New Mutants doing. And I looked at her Instagram, and it was actually her Instagram that like sold me and made her my first choice, which was just these you know, images of her. Yeah, everyone uses Instagram differently, but hers were often less staring out at things and looked quite. There was an arty side to them, and then there was a lot of photos about like her love of Robert Altman movies or her love of, you know, horror movies. And I was like, all right, this person, you know, it kind of just intrigued me. And so once we started casting, it's a whole process, and it's Hollywood set up in a really difficult way where basically it's kind of a nightmare for filmmakers where the managers of these people, you have to just offer them the role. You can't meet them, you can't have them, you know, like it's just okay, I guess I could. So I kind of resisted that because I only had New Mutants to go on, and we went through a process with other people, and eventually I just said, you know what, can I meet her? Can you just get a chance for me to meet her first before I offer it? And somehow they wrangled it that I could. She's jumped on the Zoom, and the first line out of her mouth was, I just have to tell you that my boyfriend's a big fan of your podcast. And I was like, something inside me went, oh my God, this is gonna happen. Like I just had a feeling like I can get the person I like. Really was my first choice. Like the person we also had, you know, looked at Mickey Madison, and they were like, oh, she's got a new film with Sean Baker she's working on. I was like, oh, at least my instincts are good.
yeah.
But so me and Blue had, and then I don't think we talked about the movie at all for about 40 minutes. We talked about movies. We talked about you know, a lot of the filmmakers that we had in common. And I only gave her one movie to watch. There's this really strange movie called Remember My Name that I had only just seen recently with Anthony Perkins, and it's like a woman gets released from jail and just starts stalking this Anthony Perkins. He doesn't know, the audience doesn't know what it is. Like you don't, for a long time, you don't know what the movie is, and it's an incredible tension. And so I was like, watch this, like watch the way she looks at people, and that was like kind of the only movie reference. I didn't show her Possession on purpose because I knew so far, even though I like it when it's referenced by these recent movies, they are kind of just taking the crazy part of it, the part where the
Yeah.
person's having the freak out. So it's like whether it's First Omen or Nosferatu, I'm glad that it's back in the conversation. I'm glad that actresses are discovering it too. But I also think they're sometimes quoting it in a way that, and I didn't want her to just do that. I wanted this to be a more internal piece. And so yeah, once we, we, because this was very low budget. I mean, I've already I did see one person write on Letterboxd, they're like, oh, I really like this movie, but I think they probably should have hired the studio should have hired a female director for this material. And I was like, well, this isn't a studio film; it's an independent that I had to fund myself. So, and I just want to tell the story. So, I understand that way of thinking though, because if you see
Yeah.
Shudder, you think it's bigger than it is, and so the actors all had to be willing to work for basically what they call favorite nations, which just means everyone's getting equal scale. So for her to do that, she had to see something in the script. She had also been on some TV, and some of her TV, she said, kind of forces you to act fairly generally. And I don't want to say the word bad, because obviously there's different kinds of TV, like Ozark's a different thing, but like the kind of more general shows where everything's a little bigger. And I think she was quite put off by doing that and was just looking for a reinvention and something very stripped down and real. And so I think timing and everything just are lucky. And then we got her, and she was still finishing another show for for the first, those office scenes where she's meant to be really tired, she had to shoot for a whole day. I think it's Blackish. It's like a spinoff of Blackish, the show. She was doing a guest star in that. She had to shoot all day with them and then come to us at night because of some overlap that on their end, not our end. And so she was really, the opening was like, oh man, she is really exhausted and she's going all in. And from then on, she just gave us absolutely everything. There was nothing left on the floor. And she, in terms of profession, I think sometimes when you see someone who's very realistic, you're like, I wonder if they're real actors or just good at being themselves. Or like, she's like so professional, it's insane. Her continuity mind is better than anyone who was on set. She knew where she was meant to be physically, what was their costume. It was just, so this was like a real pro. And she just, she just like brought in all the different things she was going through. I think we're all going through stuff like, losses and stuff. And I think, this is right at the end of the pandemic that this is getting made. So I think the fact that it turned out a lot sadder than it did scary, because the script might have turned out a little scarier than sad, I think it tipped the balance when we just all were, using this movie to put all our crap. But yeah, I still feel very lucky, and I can still watch the whole movie. I can sit at a theater, watch the whole thing when it projects, and it's only because I'm watching her. It's not, I'm sick of seeing all the stuff that we did, but she just still seems very alive to me in that, ironically, in that in the role.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think, Donato and I watch a lot of independent horror film in particular. And, I mean, I don't want to disparage any other films, but when everything kind of works except that central performance isn't quite right. It's like that's the thing that kind of keeps it from getting over the hill and getting to something great. And I think you have that with Blue. I think she's fantastic in this.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad. Yeah.
Gosh, we could talk about your film for a very, very long time. Donato, is there anything else you want to bring up? Because I do want to talk about Kurosawa too. I am biased in that Elric brought us a banger, and I want to talk about that. So, any last questions before we move to the second half of the episode?
No, we're reaching that time, and I got to talk about dating in LA very briefly. So I brought my expertise to the pod.
Yep, I'm not gonna lie. When I was watching Elric's film, I was kind of like, "Oh, Donato. I hope Donato actually hasn't watched this one. He doesn't need this this baggage. It's just gonna bring up too many demons for you."
Oh, this was number 2, so I already knew what I was getting into because this was a rewatch after Fantasia, which again, like, very funny. You mentioned before how like tight knit you kept this because Fantasia happens, and all of a sudden I see the announcement. I'm like, oh shit, Elric made a movie. Like I had no idea until it got announced there.
Yeah, no, it really was pretty down low because I don't know, you just never know how it's all going to shake out, And Fantasia, like, quick shout out, that's the festival, like, I think one of the best ones to launch if you want to feel a little bit nurtured versus just like you're in a city and everyone sees it and the critics run to the press room. It's not like that. It really feels like they're looking at, and also you get 2 screenings, and I'll say the first screening is always going to be a little hard because you're just reacting yourself. And so the second screening was like still my favorite of all the screenings so far, just because you kind of settle into it. And yeah, it's a special place.
I love that. Yeah, I've still never been, but your story, both sides of the aisle, the filmmakers, the film critics, everybody talks about it like it's something special. So
it is. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that it continues to live up to that reputation.
I will say that if as we transfer to Kiyoshi as a professional podcaster myself,
Correct. Thank you.
it does connect to the filmmaking. So as we get into it, it wasn't just the film chosen. I really was trying to also pick one of the films that had not necessarily an influence on the story, but did have an influence. So I'll try to thread it together as we go there.
Okay. All right. Well, that is our kickoff. Then we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Retribution. Stick around. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to be talking about Kurosawa's 2006 film Retribution. And if you haven't seen it, and again, surprisingly, it feels like one of his. I never understand why his films aren't breathed in the same breath as Clive Barker, John Carpenter, that kind of stuff. But if you haven't seen it, a quick plot synopsis for you. When the body of a young woman is found face down in a pool of salt water, the case is given to Yashoka, a veteran homicide detective who lives in the area. But as Yashoka digs deeper into the case, he begins to find eerie similarities between the killer's methodology and the minutiae of his own life. A missing button here, a cord from his apartment complex there. Soon Yashoka will come face to face with the ghost of a murdered woman, but he holds out hope that this victim may have found the wrong suspect to haunt. Another film from Japanese horror auteur Kiyoshi Kurosawa, Retribution is yet another in his long line of mundane apocalypses. All right, Elric, your film. Can you walk us through? I mean, do you remember when you first saw this? I guess. Do you remember the first time that you sat down and saw this film? Because Lionsgate release, like theoretically had some theatrical distribution back in the day, maybe.
I like that you just said mundane apocalypse. I'm channeling the mundane apocalypse. Okay, so this one wasn't on my radar at all when we wrote this. I obviously, and like a lot of people, I was a massive fan of Cure, Pulse a lot too, but I didn't want to overdo the Pulse just because the topics interconnect a little bit with the internet. And it was like maybe 2 weeks before he started shooting, and I was like, oh, I wonder how Kurosawa shoots certain things and like kind of office scenes and something. So I started looking up a couple of the ones I hadn't seen. I did rewatch Cure, but then I was like, oh, what haven't I seen? And there was a couple I hadn't seen. There's another one I almost picked for this called Seance, which also doesn't have a lot of reviews, which is kind of a remake of Seance on a wet afternoon, but it's that one didn't stay with me in the same way, This one, I guess it was like one of those. I don't think it was an 8 Films to Die For, but it was some sort of set, one of the Tartan, one of these sets of movies. And I remember just kind of dismissing the cover at the time. When I looked this up for your show, it had 2 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes.
Still does.
So I was like, damn. So I was surprised I was going to get to bring this in. It's like the perfect thing. And so I only watched this, about 2 weeks before I started shooting, and I was kind of struck by similarities, not so much in story, but there was a couple ideas in there for sure that I was like, oh, this is interesting how he's shooting, this is how he's approaching it. You sometimes forget with him how wide everything is. Like just these long takes that are so wide, and like, so he's just really relying on you settling into his mood and pacing to carry you through. It's very unusual, much more classical Japanese cinema than horror J cinema in a lot of ways. That's where I think he's quite different than some of the other filmmakers of this period. But it really struck me as I actually liked it even more watching it again yesterday, to be honest. Like, but on first view, I was like, wow, this is him kind of mainstream at times. Like, it felt some bigger ideas, but then when the ideas explain themselves, no, they're not. It's the same ideas of all Cure and Pulse. There's something bigger in the society that he seems to be feeling guilt for, and that's what the Retribution. So I was just really struck. I love movies that get under your skin, and he really has the ability to just slowly work his way under. And I love the Koji Yakushi is just one of those actors, whether it was Tampopo or last year's like Perfect Days. He's just the face of Kurosawa movies, basically. And this was an interesting one because he's a tortured guy. The crime, I'll try to stay spoiler free, but the crimes start pointing to him, and he doesn't understand that. And you kind of believe straight away, like, this guy couldn't have done this, but unless it's going to be one of those, mental switcheroos. And I just found that to be, watching him with the shoe on the other foot versus something like Cure, to be really compelling. And then when he does have ghosts come into the story, it's so bold in this one, and the red dress and the kind of the flying stuff that should usually take me out of a movie, right? Like in this time,
Yeah.
I was like still a little like whoa, and then I'm like, no, you kind of somehow you made it work for me. I don't. It's pretty interesting, but yeah. So it was only a couple weeks before shooting, so it definitely Kurosawa is definitely an influence overall on me. So it was interesting to get to see one that I hadn't seen and one that's this entertaining.
I love that you bring up kind of like the wide shots too, because that was actually something that stood out to me in the dead thing is the for one of the first times we see Alex, it's that pan down from the LA skyscraper, and then you see her walking across the footbridge pedestrian walkway, and there was just so much space in that shot. That's I Donato and I talk about this all the time in movies. Movies are shot too close up, I think,
Mhm.
across the board. Like I love like I watched American Primeval, which is a Western, and it was just like so tight and compact. And I was like, no, I need landscape. So always something that I loved about Kurosawa, flagged that almost instantly with the Dead Thing too.
Interesting.
And if you can expand a little bit about that, like why is his stuff so visually arresting, knowing that he's also not a filmmaker that is working with huge budgets, right? He's a guy that moves in and out of the mainstream a little bit, but always manages to kind of consistently create something visually arresting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and sound is. I think he relies on
Mhm.
sound, so he knows he can go do a wide shot because he knows the sound outside of that. So we're talking about like the diegetic space, right? Like outside
Yeah.
of the frame, the world is continuing, and that's something I think a lot of film and Lynch obviously is the other filmmaker springs to mind. These are guys who really have confidence in building the world that's beyond just the frame. So I think the wides, I can't. It's a hard thing to understand why he approaches it that way. Like it's the opposite of Ingmar Bergman, basically. Like what and I also like that in Polanski. The people who are using framing, they are also influences like really close. The opposite of going even closer, at some point. But I think with Kurosawa, I bet you some of it's cultural. Like Ozu was kind of Ozu's films don't look like his in terms of the what they're about, but they are often wide, low to the ground. There seems to be a cultural connection to showing a character isolated,
Mhm.
against society and things like this. But again, I went to Cloud, which is his newest one, and Chime, which is very similar to these ones we're talking about. Chime really works in
Yeah.
conversation with, but the new one, Cloud, and somebody asked him a question about space, and he couldn't articulate it himself. They're like, "Why does your camera move like this?" And why is there always space behind characters? And a lot of it is just your gut, and then it's developed, into that. And so I do think it works very well for the kind of stories he's telling, and I love the way characters look when they're just walking through these spaces of the city. Again, like you said, the opening shot of Dead Thing definitely is in that vein, which is if you watch Westworld, that's the overbridge from Westworld, and we stole
Nice.
stole it after hours, so they can come for me now, because that's where I worked on that in that area. So you just have to steal those things. And so sometimes you want to show. Also, if you're making an independent film, you are also trying to show off things that will make it look a little bigger. So the
Mhm.
the human face on the close up is the cheapest effect, and then if you have good locations, show them off. So, but hard to know exactly why the way he constructs his films, but I think the sound is equally important.
Yeah, I was almost gonna say it's like a challenge to the filmmaker, and you just said it exactly there. Like the easiest way for someone to convey emotion or get a scare as a filmmaker is to do a close-up shot. Like everything close up, just it's in your face. It's a jolt. It's all these things. The tighter and closer, the more we can get a rise out of you. So I love how a filmmaker would be like, all right, we're just going to have this shot linger on a woman in the corner of the room for how long, and like trying to generate fear and terror from so much, I don't want to say like empty space, but that is part of it too. I think, if in a haunted house movie, if I see an entire two rooms that are completely empty and just one person and a ghost over here, like I think you can make that effectively creepy the way you shoot that. And I think that's a great example of, again, I think of the woman in the red dress just sitting in the corner of the room. And you have the lead character just trying to like literally just talking to it, being like, what else do I have to do? What else is left for me to do? And there is like a panic and a desperation, but still like a fear and a tension. And all of that is achieved while still doing like the anti-horror thing, doing the anti, Evil Dead remake. Everything's terrifying because it's just a quick jump to somebody's face and it takes up the whole camera. Like I am still more, you know, as a movie watcher, I am more impressed when I have, you know, Monocle mentioning westerns. I want to see the whole goddamn landscape. I want to see
Oh
everything
yeah.
there. I want to digest everything. I don't understand why we're leaving so much background just left cut out. Like that is,
It's
I
part of the
agree.
language, right? Like the
Yeah.
Right,
Western, that
exactly.
is the language. Like if you're going to make it, that's the opening shot, or it should be the landscape. You know, you can mess with it if you're Sergio Leone, right? Like start on the eyes and then pan out to reveal it or something. But no, I like one of the other things that in this case, like the really wide shots where so in this case people have been like drowned in salt water, which the little details are also what I find unnerving. Like the
Hmm.
specific, like at one point we see a woman drive to get salt water and put it in bottles before something bad's gonna happen, and it's really dread inducing. That's the key word, right? This is different kind of horror. This is like a feeling of dread is going to follow you for the next hour and a half, and it's going to grow in intensity. But that there won't be anything else. There's not going to be some big shock. But the scenes where they would drown someone, you would have, or you'd see a flash to it. It would be super wide, and you'd be watching it as a long take of somebody being forced into this little puddle or whatever. And I found that to be very not just disturbing, but also that's the sad part. That's the you're just a body lying there, and there's just some trash over there, and you're in a empty space, kind of like Michael Mann. How all his movies are like non-places, you know, like you watch his movies,
Hmm.
he shoots in all the places that no one else goes to, and that makes for a very interesting kind of cinema. And I just think the wide shot shows it off so well, and you get bigger ideas as you're sitting there ruminating, because they are a little bit more dreamy in the sense that you have more space to think because you're not being overloaded with information and story as much, and with the cuts in a sense.
And I do think like the J horror still exists here. It is
Mhm.
not on the level, again, let's say on The Ring or Pulse or things of that nature. Those are more straightforward horror, but you still have the wetness of J horror. Like it's just
Oh yeah.
icky and gross. Like you said, the salt water that and the sounds that accompany that, like the drowning sounds, or just like, oh my god, the water pouring out of a corpse's mouth, like the sound of that is just nauseating. So you have the elements that we see in J horror. And I mean, again, if you're listening to this podcast, you know we talk about spoilers sometimes, so we will get a little into spoiler territory. If you would like to stop listening and go watch the film, pause now. But the next part I want to bring up is also the unexpected ghost story, let's say. And I think the fun part about watching both The Dead Thing this morning and this movie Retribution right after that
Hmm.
is connecting dots that I never would have connected had I watched these films completely separate. And
Hmm.
no, they're not exactly one for one. Like obviously there are thematic elements here that are different at play. But
Sad lack of flying in the Dead Thing. I think if I had
right,
one
yeah.
note, Elric, is there should have
Where
been
was the
more. Alex should have
fantasy?
flown. I'm
If
just
I had
throwing it
had
out
more
there.
money, we came so close. No, but it's funny because I had the same reaction rewatch because I watched it before I shot, and it was nothing to do with the writing, right? So it wasn't a connection in my mind at all. Then you make a movie, and then I'm watching it this morning before we do the show. I'm like, oh yeah, that reminds me of that, and that reminds me of that's cool. Like it was interesting. But you're right about the J horror. I would say
Yeah.
the J horror in this one is I would say the most of any of his movies. That's why maybe I meant by the mainstream. It's not the overarching idea is very much Kiyoshi Kurosawa, but there are moments in this that are closer to other J horror that he has never really done that before. And so that, especially specifically around the ghost and the way she looks and feels and comes at camera, and she almost feels like an extension of the woman from Pulse who is wearing red, which is also very uncanny. But yeah, no, I saw it too. It was kind of cool. I was kind of enjoyed going, ooh, there's a little bit of this worked its DNA in.
It's a fun, I don't want to say like detective story because the title of your film is The Dead Thing, and like
Yeah,
Retribution says very early like what is happening. But at the same time, they're both sneaky ghost stories. Like
right.
the way that you work in the spirits and apparitions where you don't expect them to be where they are. That connective tissue was a fun double feature, let's say, and so unexpected. So I love the way you can watch two films completely separate and have thoughts completely singular to them, but then you put them together and all of a sudden you unlock this weird double bill of connected tissue that you never would have actually put together analytically had you not watched them back to back. And I really had that here. And I think again it plays really well in Retribution where I didn't expect it, because my brand of horror is a little more in your face. Like I am more taken by stuff that is adrenaline thrill seeker horror, but watching this, it is fantasy in a way. Like it is fantasy horror with the flying around. The effects are, they can be a little, I don't want to say janky by any means,
Mm-hmm.
but you're watching a Lionsgate release version, and at least on Amazon Prime, the one I rented is like VHS quality. It was not the best quality, so it didn't showcase exactly. But I did not get scared in the way I was expecting to, but at the same time, the story was still inviting because it was a little bit whimsical and super dark and dreadful at the same time. As you said,
Yeah.
it's dreary, it's morose. Like, this is a very kind of like seeps into your bones film, and that is just as bad as, say, the outright Waniver scream machine, like one of those.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to have room for all. I think we're also like, we all have things we cater to more towards as horror fans, but like almost everything, if it's interesting and good and grabs us, and that's I think you have to just make the thing that's like true to what you would want to see the most. That's like one of the keys. I think sometimes people, to break in, try to make something that isn't exactly what they want to see, and that's when I tend to be the least interested in indie films. I always want to see, like, what is the thing, like Jeremy Gardner's Making the Battery. That's the thing you want to see. You're filling that gap. It works because of that. So I definitely had that in mind. And I think Kurosawa doesn't, I don't know what he thinks of horror films in general, but I know what he's trying to make. And he doesn't care if you get a jump or a jolt, or, there's some stuff built in for that, but he's going for something, right? A mood. And he's certainly achieving that mood through these films. But it's, yeah, this one just definitely operates a little differently than some of his others too.
So, Elric, when we were talking about the dead thing, one of the first things you said is that it was really important to you that LA be present and a character, and have contribute a lot to the film. I know that Kurosawa's always made films about Tokyo, about urban decay and urban malaise, but it felt like, watching Retribution for the first time, it sort of felt like this was his treatise on society, like the physical manifestation of society, sort of like dialed all the way up to 11. So can you share a little bit on what your thoughts were kind of watching this, and how he presents civilization in this movie in particular?
I think I think Japan, obviously Japan's gone through a hell of a lot culturally, more than most countries in a short amount of time, right? So imagine like losing religion and the entire fabric of the culture of a country, and then kind of being reborn. And I think there seems to be a lot of guilt. I mean, in this, we see a father, kill a son so he won't be shamed. We see there's obviously somebody kills a person they're having an affair with, who now is going to make it right to not get this secret known. Like the fabric. I think he's commenting on something about, and obviously the main ghost is somebody who is doing this. Again, we're in spoilers. Doing this because people didn't pay attention. People didn't do something. Honestly, the funniest thing that came to my mind while I was watching this, I was like, "Oh, it's the ending of Seinfeld." it's how
Yeah,
Seinfeld
no,
ended.
yeah.
It's like, oh, you didn't do it. You stood by, and now you go to jail. So Jerry Seinfeld, in this case, it's and there's something. I mean, look, and where we are right now, it's like, I get it. Like, but on the flip side, and especially true to the culture we're in, we often feel like there's nothing we can do that's going to do anything. We feel so like, oh, but even if I did do something, then what happens? Nothing. And so I think it's, and so I don't know if that's what he's grappling with, but I think he's definitely interested in something, especially the ending of Pulse, where he's saying this is gonna come apart. These are not positive perceptions of where things are headed. I think he is somebody who has been warning, where he sees a lot of the culture going from technology, and unfortunately, like I've been noticing, especially the last couple of years, like we don't really take our warnings very well. Like we can beat a drum for 40 years with apocalyptic movies, and you can still just end up right in one. And it's which is kind of fascinating, because you would think that the lessons would be there, because we've seen Logan's Run, or we've seen Soylent Green, or whatever it is, and then somehow they all come back up as things we're dealing with. So I think he is somebody who is dealing almost in the ideas and writing of stories almost in that science fiction parable way, but he's like with warnings and dystopias,
Yeah.
but he's setting them in the present, and he's kind of going all in, which I give somebody a lot of credit to do it movie after movie.
It's definitely it feels more like Richard Matheson than horror, right? It's sort of
That's a good way
like
to put it. Yeah.
pre-apocalypse, like the things that are happening that people will look back on or tell stories about, and like, this is how the world ended. But Chime, I think we've all brought that up. Donato and I've talked about it on the podcast. A great example. All of his films do this, where it's sort of civilization coming apart at the seams, and nobody notices before it's too late. But I love in particular how hard he hits that sort of at the end of the movie too, where you get, again, we're deep into spoiler territories, but we get those the ghost saying that I died so everyone else has to die, I died so everyone else has to die, and the shot of him kind of what I think of is a Kurosawa shot of like one lone character like wandering, industrial streets with like paper flowing everywhere and nothing going on. There's just something to me that's sadder about that particular moment in time than like a 28 days later, like after everything has already happened. It's more tragic to be in a period where like maybe somebody could have done something. Maybe there was a difference that could have been made for these characters, but again, everybody's on the 810 ferry uptown, and they missed their window to make change happen.
She's pretty harsh, as the
Yeah.
ghost is pretty. It doesn't. I don't think I fully grasped it as well as I did this time. The first time I saw it with the ending, and I think you're right. The end. I think at the traditional ending to especially a ghost story, but especially a Hollywood version of this, would absolutely have him collecting the bones, and that is what ends the ghost story. Instead, the feeling you get from this is that he is going to spread this. He is going to walk off with the bones, and it's only going to get worse. And that's it's a pretty dark way to view it. Again, it might just, I love a slightly open interpretation ending, and which he tends to have. But it's really interesting when you when that's your viewpoint of the world. Like, and we're talking
Yeah.
movie after movie. It's not, he's not really dialing it back.
No, and that was why I was so taken by Mads last year. Like, it
Mhm.
was one of my favorite horror movies, also on Shudder. And I talked about, I've mentioned it before, but it is a movie about the beginning of the end. We don't know what happens after. It is literally the zombie, whatever you want to call it, outbreak is going to happen, and you
Yeah.
see it from such an intimate point of view of three characters and how it affects them. And again, to me, that is so much more horrifying because everything is fine at the beginning of these movies. Like, everything is going along as we assume society would. And all we get to see is the little bit of the beginning. And like, we don't know if there's a way to prevent it at the end. We don't know what happens after that. The whole world blows up, maybe, or we turn it around. Who knows? But there is so much more. It's what your brain does. It's what your mind does with that afterwards. And especially the kind of period we are in right now, especially us here in America, it's hard to think that there can be good out of this, because I don't want to be too fucking cynical and shit. Like, I still have hope. I still think that we can turn things around, but at the same time, 20 fucking 16 happened already, and we were dumb enough to do it again. Like, how am I supposed to come into this with some kind of optimism? Like, no, I watch Retribution. I'm like, yeah, everyone's fucked. Like, there's no coming out of this. Like,
Yeah.
A little bit of, and I think the one thing that movies share, and also just like beliefs, is you have to be willing that if we're going to turn around, or if we're going to survive, at some point we're just going to have to be able to face ourselves in the mirror and like actually ask questions about ourselves, our own complicity to things, our own, not just like put them all out of our view and move on for comfort's sake. And that's really what's been happening. And I think that's one of the things he's interested in. And like, I knew we there was no version of our story that we could get to where it was going to have a happy ending. We kicked the tire. We liked working with Blue so much while we were making the movie. We were like, maybe it could end differently. And you were like, no, this is what it's about. It's a circle, and it's a a doomed character, a doomed storyline. And I think, but there's ways out of that. But people who deny it and just hide everything, and I think it's just become very easy to do that. So. I mean, we're all guilty of it. So, and that's what I think I think he's basically saying we're all guilty. Now look at collective guilt.
Well, one person is innocent. I think Yoshoka was let off the hook.
Yeah.
So good for him, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Doomed to wander the world alone.
Yeah, exactly.
I do want to ask a little bit, because we talked a lot about the full breadth of Kurosawa's work, and again, multiple hats for you, Elric, college professor, filmmaker, etc. It still feels like we haven't quite had the reckoning that we should have with this filmmaker. And I don't know if that's just a function of the period of time that he worked in, that he doesn't get sort of the A-list. I mean, he has a Criterion film, but he doesn't sort of get the same push that a lot of folks that were working in the 80s do, because we needed, distance and a little bit of space to reevaluate. But I guess if you're somebody who knows Kurosawa but hasn't dug into his body of work, I mean, how would you pitch this to students or horror fans? How would you talk about being like, this is why this is a filmmaker that folks should know. This is why I went and watched his movies before I made my movie, because this is someone that should be in the cultural conversation ongoing.
I think he's like kind of maybe a little bit like in the way that Michael Mann's less studied than Scorsese. Scorsese is more fun, more showy, more identifiable in that way. The other director who, and Michael, don't get me wrong, Michael Mann is like now being well studied, but there's a long period where he wasn't. And I think
Hmm.
because all those films are kind of blend together, and he's going for something, one thing the whole time, like that's what he's drilling down on, thief drilling literally, but he is really looking at something, this kind of macho professionalism in men, what that means. Like this is the thing you study, and I think Kurosawa is a little bit the same, where he's, unlike some other filmmakers, like like no one, I mean, like we could ask probably 10 horror fans right now the name of the director of Ring, and Ringu is the better horror, like one of the great horror films of Japan, but probably no one remembers the director because their body of work is more varied and they haven't like been as consistent. So he's been like consistently interested in these same things. He's made non-horror films that are interesting too, and like just he's tried other things, kind of a little bit Wes Craveny in that way, like trying to do something but never got as much acclaim. And so I think when somebody is this consistent, and also I think one thing is it's modern, so he's often making modern movies, and then they're not fun. Now it's fun to
Yeah.
me to watch them, and so this comes down to the kind of, like, I like bleaker movies, I like dark movies, I like weird stuff. So I'm perfect for for watching this kind of stuff. But I also understand why that doesn't become the first thing. Like I see why somebody picks John Carpenter to write about first, because Carpenter is also a brilliant technician in the same way, but he is somebody who's also been about entertaining. So the function of a movie as entertainment is not how the whole world views cinema, right? It just isn't.
Hmm.
Like, and that word is also misleading, because entertainment is like, oh, I'm having fun, versus if I'm fully mesmerized and engaged in something, I don't need to be smiling. I would walk out going, that entertained me, as in it held my attention. But I'm also a hardcore nerd at this stuff, so it's like not everyone's going to feel that way, right? So I think those are some of the reasons why maybe he's been understudied. I'd say why he should be studied is, and I think why it's turning. It was ridiculous how long Cure took to come, because it's like probably top 10 of the last like 30 years type of movie. But I think because of that impulse, I think he's talking about a modern ailment, a modern disease, of the being a human in the modern world, and the kind of sickness in all his movies that I think are going to, somebody could write something really pretty special and pretty interesting on that, and kind of link them together in a way. So I think it's just a matter of time, and I'm sure that person's out there writing now as we speak. But it's just, I think the lack of just, as Matt was saying, in terms of like even what he's drawn to, like going for something big and bold. The Monkey comes out this way, like with big laughs and big things, like
Yeah.
that's just a different kind of movie making, and they both should exist in the canon of horror. That's what's cool about horror. It can hold both of these conversations, but I do think one is a subtler thing that maybe needs to catch up and takes its time. I'm just glad he's still making films, and I hope
Hmm.
he gets to keep doing that. And before, I hope he understands that. I think he's pretty well respected around the world. Because he's making genre. I'd say in Japan, maybe he's less respected, not respected, but like maybe not written about as much because he's in genre. So like we talk about it because he makes genre, but in other avenues that might lessen how people view him, the way Carpenter took a long time to get respected. So
Yeah.
it's a double-edged sword.
Well, that brings us to the last question we always ask our guests, which is Retribution. Great film. I think it's a great film. I'm glad to have finally knocked this one off my list. But Donato, I always end with these conversations about, well, how does it get unforgotten, right? How does it start to earn the audience? And there aren't any distribution trickeries with this. It's available for rent on all the major platforms. So it's not like a lot of Japanese horror where like it ends up in right sale for too many years, and Rob Hunter has a bootleg and that's the only reason that anybody knows how to see it, right? So that's the thing we always want to know is like how does Retribution eventually find its audience here in the States, and become a movie that people refer back to in this period of, let's say, 2000, 2010, 2015, that we're still kind of trying to feel out.
Well, I think there's a few parts to that. Number one, yes, it was available, but to Matt's point, it did not look great. And I mean, it looked fine. Like it looked like maybe it was from the DVD. I don't think it was probably VHS, but it was definitely kind of soft. And that's the version on Amazon. It is definitely not HD. So first off, I think somebody giving it a proper restoration and a re-release, and someone like Kurosawa, all his films should be at that level. And
Hmm.
I don't know if there is a version in Japan yet, but so I think that first stop is somebody saying, "Hey, we should be making sure, especially out in the shadow of Criterion, putting out a couple of his films, or at least Cure." I think that's where the conversation should start. Is like somebody should restore this, make sure it looks the best it can, because I think that's usually the first sign. And then it, it comes down to people like us talking about it, that this might be lesser compared to his biggest movies, but it also might be an easier endpoint than some of his movies. Like, honestly, I think this might be, of
Yeah.
all his movies, one of the ones I could imagine first giving to someone who was into J horror and going, this might get you into this director. There's also a big documentary called The J Horror Virus that just came out this year, and he's in that, interviewed quite a bit. There's a lot of really interesting interviews in that, and I think hopefully that gets people a little more interested again. But it's a great question. Most of the time on my pods, I am talking about like you guys, not the same parameters, but like things that have fallen through the cracks. And I have found that from doing that for a decade, many of the movies that I have championed at some point, not because necessarily, sometimes it might be because of us, but have just eventually done restored. And it's an amazing thing to see where somebody writes to you and go, hey, did you see this thing that this obscure thing is now not obscure? Even just Possession, the fact that it was, when I was first banging the drum, it was this thing you couldn't even find, and now I'm sick of it, and it's my favorite movie. So that tells you how far the culture, now it's memed to death. But that's the exciting part. So I think if we keep talking about movies, keep that cultural conversation alive about why they're important, and I think I think that one will get back in there.
Yeah, I think we're all, I mean, we're not talking about our favorite college band here. Like, all of us would be thrilled if all of these like little niche movies that we champion, and suddenly everybody watches it, and it's like Letterboxd is doing interviews and saying, this film is on my top 4. That's a win. Everybody's happy about that.
Totally.
Donato, are you are you building out a marketing plan for Retribution in your head right now? Do you have the answer to all our questions?
I mean, I did just take a gander, and I do not see a Blu-ray of it anywhere, at least in the Americas and stuff like that. So I'm sure one exists in Japan, but for all these boutique labels, I'm sure we're going to get a Kurosawa box set somewhere. If that does not exist already outside of the States. So that would be, just for me, the first way to do it. You do get the connectivity with Pulse and these more popular, let's say, quote unquote, known titles. So then you put Retribution in with that box set and somebody buys it, and all of a sudden they're watching it that way. And I mean, it's unfortunate because the 2000s era, this was the perfect example of an overseas film that was snatched up by a Lionsgate or someone like that. And it was Lionsgate who just throws it on DVD, probably didn't market it that much, and wham, now it's just in their catalog, stuck there. And they're not going to do anything else with it ever. It just sat there. And it's a testament to the fact that Rotten Tomatoes was starting to pay a little more attention to horror at this point, 2007, 2008. So it's not even like it was the 2000 on the nose. So for it to have 2 reviews, and I think like they're from literally like a year or 2 ago. Like, I know Paul A is one of them, and he just wrote about it on Bloody like not long ago. So this is one of those movies that just got flat out ignored. There's some also like fan reviews on there saying like the opposite of what we're saying, and being like, oh, like Kurosawa just replaced all the scares with goofy comedy and shit. So I think there is, the opposite appetite for a movie where he is taking risks that are more fantastical versus the in your face, the conversation of mainstream versus like, other people watching it. But at the end of the day, like, it just got shoved under the rug, and for it to get that notice again, I don't think there's a better way than doing like a Kurosawa retrospective box set. Like, throw it in there. Umbrella just did this whole Thai retrospective box set that I did a little work on, and it's awesome to catch up on these Thai horror movies that you probably have missed doing so. And I think like that's the best way right now. These boutique labels are really going to bat for movies that no one else is talking about.
Mm-hmm. All right, there we have it. We are going to we're going to see a retribution resurgence at some point in the next couple of years. Lionsgate, you have gold. I don't know if you have gold. I don't know if you know that you have gold, but you do. Talk to any of us. We'd be happy to tell you why. It's a great film. Elric, like Donato said, I've been listening to you for years, man. It was really great to have you join us on the podcast today. And I know that you're still heavily promoting kind of it's only been 2 weeks at this point with the Dead Thing. So if folks want to see you continue to share behind the scenes stuff, talk about how the film is doing with fans, what social media, if any, are you using? I think you're on Blue Sky. I think I found you and added you, or somebody who's imitating you, which potentially could be a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, so you review Retribution today. That's how I knew. I was like, all right, I know what we're doing tonight.
Yep.
That was good. Yeah, I'm kind of, I went off X, which was hard to do. Some people talk about it, but it's pretty hard because you're actually leaving a lot more people, potentially if
Mm.
they're really even there. And then Blue Sky's taking a while to kind of regrow, but I do like how nice everyone is there. Blue Sky seems pretty positive so far. Instagram is the one I tend to just use the most, for not for any other reason, just like it just seems to be the easiest to share stuff and to show pictures, and for the film stuff, that's what I've been using the most. And the place I most like to be is Letterboxd. It's my favorite place to go to talk about movies, except my own. I don't need to read that I from the moment it hits Shudder, I'm good. But I did enjoy. It's just I think it's doing what you guys were just asking about, what for Retribution. I do think Letterboxd is a big piece of the youth puzzle of keeping movies in the center of culture and important, and people are excited, and I think young people are going back to movie theaters in a way, especially in the cities with retro screenings. So I take hope. I'm not quite as bleak as Kurosawa here. I think I take hope that there's still a bit of a spark to all of this, and I hope that continues.
I won't ask you what it is, but I'm always curious as people that are both inside and around the industry. Do you have a letterbox burner, or are you all on main?
No, I just use my main. I just haven't had the
Love it.
energy. Now I understand now, like the filmmaker understands it, because it is not that your people are adding you there, right? Obviously, but it is a lot more than you want to take in. The hot tip for being a filmmaker is you just change your settings to highest rated first, and then you can choose what descent of hell you want to go into. But it is it is good, always good to remember that if you make weird work, or if you love weird movies like I do, I had to remind myself, oh yeah, why would I think you can't get everyone on board. If you want to make Nicholas Rogue movies, don't expect everyone. Not everyone loved Nicholas Rogue movies, so it's a good reminder.
All right, just the main one then for you. Donato, where do people find you, connect with you with all the stuff you got going on?
It is the same place as always, at Donatobomb on Twitter. Sorry, I keep fucking saying it. I have been off Twitter. No, Blue Sky, Letterboxd, and Instagram. Which South by is gearing up here. I can't believe it's 2 weeks away, and I just booked my hotel today, so I will be there, and I will be reviewing a ton of stuff. There's some really cool horror movies. I mean, Clown in a Cornfield is going to be
Cool.
premiering there.
Friend of the show, we love
friend
him.
of the show, Mr. Adams. So very excited for that. But also the director of Tucker. And anyway, I could talk about that forever. Anyway, lots of stuff to talk about at South by. So follow me at Donatobomb on all the socials. And yeah, you're going to get tons of reviews and content coming out of there.
Can I ask a question, guys? What dating app is Matt going to be on? Because I think anyone watching this episode is going to be like, oh, so what's his main dating app?
It is just Hinge. I have said this before.
Right.
I only have time for one at this point. I don't have the energy for so many, and Hinge is the one that I don't know. It has more personality to it. It's much less the Tinder of it all. So you can find me on there if you want to.
So there you go. If you are, I'll tell you what, if you're a publicist and Matt Donato's not answering your emails anywhere else, and you really, really want him to see your screener, find him on Hinge at South by Southwest. Send him the link that way. As for myself, you can find me on Blue Sky. It's monogle.bsky.social. Follow this podcast. You've got the Apple Podcast, you got Spotify, all your normal places to go. And visit www.certifiedforgotten.com to read some of our incredible film criticism about small films, just like Retribution. Elric, great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys. I'm glad. Hey, we might give this a little new life for Retribution. It's cool.
We're doing the bump. The Certified Forgotten bump is not a thing. It probably won't ever be a thing, but based on our criteria, but who knows? Maybe we will. Donato, do your thing.
It's so squishy.